630 CE, Mecca. A man walks into the most sacred site in Arabia carrying a stick. Around him, the idols of 360 gods. One by one, he strikes them. Hubal, smash. Al-Lat, crash. Al-Uzza, gone. Manat, dust. Truth has come, and falsehood has vanished. It was a moment 60 years in the making, and it began with an orphan. If you too are a moment 60 years in the making, check out Pantheon, our brand inspired by myths, legends and folklore. We ship worldwide and are rated excellent on Trustpilot, link in the description. Sixth century Arabia, a world of tribes, hundreds of them, spread across the vast, unforgiving peninsula of desert, mountain and coast. They traded with each other, raided each other, formed alliances and broke them. What held them together was religion. At the centre of that religion was Mecca. At the centre of Mecca was the Kaaba, a cube of stone, simple in appearance, ancient in significance. The Kaaba was the gravitational centre of religious life, a sanctuary so sacred that even warring tribes agreed to set aside their feuds during the pilgrimage season and converge on it in peace. Inside and around it stood idols, 360 of them, representing the gods of every tribe across the peninsula. The greatest among them was Hubal, a statue of red agate, housed inside the Kaaba, the god of divination. Pilgrims would cast arrows before him and read their fate in the direction in which they fell. He was the lord of the Kaaba, the chief deity of the Quraysh, the tribe that controlled Mecca and served as guardians of the sanctuary. Outside stood the three great goddesses of Arabia, Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, Manat, referred to by some as the daughters of Allah. If Hubal ruled the sanctuary, they ruled the imagination of Arabia. It was a sophisticated religion, a deeply embedded system of meaning that had developed over centuries. Every tribe had its god, every god has its stone, every stone has its story. The pilgrimage that brought them all together once a year was also a trade fair, a legal assembly, a cultural gathering. The sacred and the commercial were completely intertwined, and the Quraysh sat at the centre of all of it. As the guardians of the Kaaba, they collected fees from pilgrims, they managed the sacred months, they arbitrated disputes between tribes. Their position gave them wealth, influence and authority that extended far beyond Mecca. The 360 gods were a business, an economy, a political system built on the management of the divine. The gods of Arabia were doing what the gods have always done. They were holding the world together. Having a single god meant the end of all of that. In 570 CE, a boy was born in Mecca. His name was Muhammad. His father never saw him. Abdullah died in Medina on a trading journey while his wife Amina was still pregnant. The child was born into the world already fatherless. In pre-Islamic Arabia, a child without a father was a child without protection, status, or the tribal network that determined whether you lived or died, whether you ate or starved, whether anyone would avenge you if someone wronged you. The father was everything. It was common practice in Mecca to send infants to live with nomadic desert tribes for their early years. The desert air was considered healthier. Foster mothers would travel from the desert into the city to collect infants and raise them for the first few years of their lives. For families of any standing, it was simply what you did. When the foster mothers came to Mecca, they passed the infant of Muhammad by, every one of them. No father meant no payment. One woman, Halima, took him in the end because every other child had already been claimed and she couldn't bear to return home empty-handed. Even at the beginning, nobody wanted him. He was returned to his mother, Amina, when he was around 2 years old. She died when he was 6. A journey to Medina, an illness on the road back, a grave at a place called Apparel. Now he was an orphan. His grandfather took him in, an old man, the chief of the Banu Hashim clan, who by all accounts loved the child with unusual tenderness. He let the boy sit beside him among the chiefs of the Quraysh, an honour usually reserved for leaders. 2 years later, he died too. Muhammad was 8 years old. He had lost 3 of the 4 people responsible for his existence before he was old enough to understand what loss meant. His uncle stepped forward, not the wealthiest man, not the most powerful, but willing where others weren't. He took the boy into his home and his family and treated him, the sources say, as his own son. He grew up working, tending sheep in the hills around Mecca as a child, accompanying his uncle's trading caravans as a young man across the desert to Syria through the landscapes of an Arabia that was connected to the wider world in ways the Quraysh preferred not to acknowledge. He was quiet, thoughtful, known. By the time he was in his 20s, across Mecca by a title his community gave him without being asked. Al-Amin, the trustworthy. In a city built on commerce and negotiation, the management of competing tribal interests, the most remarkable thing you could be was simply honest. Muhammad was. Everyone seemed to know it. When the tribes of Mecca argued over who had the right to replace the black stone, a sacred stone embedded in the wall of the Kaaba during renovations, a dispute that had threatened to erupt into violence, they brought the question to Muhammad to settle. He was 35 years old. He had no formal authority by then, but they trusted him anyway. He married at 25, a woman named Khadija, older than him, wealthier than him, a successful merchant who had employed him to lead her caravans. She proposed to him. By the standards of 6th century Arabia, where a man's status was everything, this was extraordinary. She saw something in him that his world had not yet found a use for. He began retreating to a cave in the mountains above Mecca around the age of 40, the cave of Hira on Mount Jabal al-Nur, the mountain of light. He would go for days at a time, alone, thinking, praying, sitting with something he couldn't name yet. Whatever he was looking for, in 610 CE, it found him. It was Ramadan, the month of fasting and contemplation, and on one of those nights something arrived, a presence, overwhelming. The angel Gabriel, appearing in the cave with a single command. Iqra, read or recite. The Arabic word carries both meanings, and scholars have debated which is more accurate ever since. Muhammad's response, as recorded in the Hadith, was immediate. I cannot read. The angel seized him, pressed him so tightly, the Hadith says, that he felt he had reached the limits of his endurance. Then released him. Then commanded again, Iqra. I cannot read. Seized again, released, a third time. Then the words came, the first 5 verses of what would become the Quran. Read in the name of your Lord who created man from a clinging substance. Read, and your Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man that which he knew not. Across religions, Moses at the burning bush, Isaiah in the temple, Paul on the road to Damascus, the first encounter with the divine is rarely described as peaceful. It overwhelms, it terrifies. Whatever you believe about the source of these experiences, the pattern is consistent. The divine, as human beings have reported it across thousands of years, does not arrive gently. Muhammad fled the cave. He came down the mountain trembling, convinced in those first moments that something had possessed him. Poets were believed to be inhabited by spirits, jinn, who spoke through them. It was a kind of madness. His first fear was that this had happened to him, that whatever had arrived in the cave was something sinister. The history of prophetic experience is a history of doubt, of men and women overwhelmed by something they didn't ask for and didn't know how to carry. The confidence came later. The terror came first. He reached his wife and could only say, "Cover me, cover me." She held him until the trembling stopped, and then, when he told her what had happened, she reassured him with his own character. "By Allah, he will never disgrace you. You maintain ties of kinship. You bear the burden of the weak. You help the destitute. You honor your guests. You assist those afflicted by calamity. A good man," she was saying, "doesn't get possessed by evil things." The foundation of one of the world's greatest religions was built on a wife's knowledge of her husband's character. She took him to her cousin, Waraka, an elderly Christian scholar who had spent his life studying the earlier scriptures. Muhammad described what had happened in the cave. Waraka listened and said, "This is the angel who came to Moses. Before Islam had a scripture, a law, or a civilization, its first confirmation came from a Christian." And then Waraka said something else, something Muhammad had not expected. "Your people will drive you out." Muhammad looked at him. "Will they really drive me out?" "Yes," Waraka said. "Anyone who has come with something like what you have brought has been treated with hostility. If I live to see that day, I will support you with all my strength." He died shortly afterwards, before any of it began. There is an event in Muhammad's life that sits unlike anything else in the story: the night journey. But before we get to what it was, we need to understand when it happened. The period before it is known as the Year of Sorrow. In the space of weeks, Muhammad lost the two people that had made everything possible: Khadija, his wife, his first believer, and Abu Talib, his uncle, the man who had taken in an 8-year-old orphan despite his own poverty and protected Muhammad through years of increasing hostility. In the same year, gone. Without Khadija, he lost the person who knew him most completely. Without Abu Talib, he had lost his protection. The Quraysh, who had been held back by tribal obligation from moving against Muhammad directly, now had no reason to hold back. It was in this moment, stripped of his two greatest supporters, increasingly isolated, the community had built in Mecca under serious threat, that even the most extraordinary event in Muhammad's prophetic career occurred. One night he was carried from Mecca to Jerusalem on a celestial creature called Burak, a winged animal said to cover impossible distances in moments. In Jerusalem, at the site Muslims call Al-Aqsa, the farthest mosque, he dismounted and entered. Waiting for him were the prophets who had come before him: Abraham, Moses, Jesus, the great messengers of the past, gathered in a single place. Muhammad stood at their head and led them in prayer. A man at the lowest point of his life, his wife gone, his protector gone, his enemies emboldened, and in this moment he is shown that he stands at the end of a line stretching back to the beginning of human history. That every prophet who came before him had been moving toward this, toward him. The precise moment of maximum vulnerability becomes the moment of maximum confirmation. And then he ascended through 7 heavens, meeting the prophets again at each level, moving upward through the architecture of the divine until he reached the presence of God. There, God ordained the 5 daily prayers, the act of worship that would become the foundation of Islamic practice, performed by 2 billion Muslims every single day. It began as 50. Moses, drawing on his own experience of leading people, urged Muhammad to go back and ask for fewer. "Your people cannot bear 50 prayers a day," he said. Muhammad returned to God. The number came down. He went back again and again until 50 became 5. 5 prayers every day for the rest of time. The God of the night journey is a God who listens when Moses says, "Your people cannot bear this," and responds by reducing the burden. The divine in this account is in conversation with humanity, adjusting, accommodating. The most demanding religious obligation in Islam, 5 prayers every day for the rest of your life, arrived as the result of a negotiation between prophets. Scholars debate whether the journey was physical or spiritual, and how the details developed across centuries of transmission. These are genuine questions that serious scholars hold different positions on. What is beyond debate is what the night journey meant for the community Muhammad was building. It placed Islam explicitly within the prophetic lineage. Abraham, Moses, and Jesus were honored, led in prayer by Muhammad. It was the final chapter of a story that had been unfolding since the beginning of human history, the structure of a civilization ordained in a single night. Within a year, Muhammad would leave Mecca entirely. The Quraysh understood exactly what was at stake. One God meant one power, and one power meant the end of everything they had built. The pilgrimage economy, the fees, the arbitration, the political authority that came with being guardians of a pan-tribal sanctuary, all of it depended on the 360 gods remaining exactly where they were. A merchant class that had spent generations building its wealth and influence on the management of the divine was not going to surrender to a man with a revelation. At first, the opposition was ridicule, mockery, the social pressure of a community turning against one of its own. Then it became something harder. Muhammad's followers, who had no tribal protection, the slaves, the poor, the vulnerable, paid first. A man named Bilal, an enslaved Abyssinian convert, was taken by his owner to the desert in the heat of the day, laid on the scorching sand, and had a massive stone placed on his chest. "Renounce Islam," his owner demanded. "Do it and this stops." Bilal's response every time was the same 2 words. Ahad. Ahad. One. One. The affirmation of God's unity. He said it until Abu Bakr, a merchant and one of Muhammad's earliest and most loyal followers, paid for his freedom. A woman named Sumaya wasn't so fortunate. She was the first person to die for Islam, killed by Abu Jahl, one of the most powerful men in Mecca, with a spear, because she refused to renounce her faith. She was a slave, had no protection. Abu Jahl knew it. The persecution was targeted. The Quraysh knew which converts had tribal protection and which didn't. The ones who did, including Muhammad himself, were shielded by the ancient obligation of tribal honor. The ones who didn't were exposed. The violence went where it could go without consequence. In 616 CE, the Quraysh went further. They imposed a total boycott on the entire Banu Hashim clan, Muhammad's tribe. No trade or marriage, no social contact of any kind. The terms were written down and hung inside the Kaaba, making it a public and unbreakable declaration. The whole clan was confined to a valley on the outskirts of Mecca for 3 years. Children screamed from hunger. People ate leaves to survive. Sympathizers inside the Quraysh smuggled food in at night, risking their own standing to keep people alive. Khadija, his wife, spent her personal fortune sustaining the community. By the time the boycott ended, broken eventually by the Quraysh members who could no longer stomach what they were doing, she had nothing left. This was the year she died. The persecution reveals something important. The Quraysh were not wrong about what Muhammad's message meant. One God did mean the end of their system. The monotheism Muhammad was preaching was an economic and political revolution dressed in religious language, and so they fought it with everything they had because they understood what it was. In 622 CE, with the Quraysh planning his assassination, Muhammad left Mecca. He slipped out in the night with Abu Bakr. The Quraysh put a price on his head. He took shelter in a cave for 3 days while pursuers searched for him. He was heading for a city called Yathrib, 300 miles to the north. It would later be renamed in his honor. Medina. Medina was expecting a mediator. The city had been tearing itself apart for a century. 2 major Arab tribes had been locked in a cycle of war, blood feud, and retaliation so entrenched that neither side could remember how it started. They needed someone outside the conflict to adjudicate, someone whose authority all parties could accept. They had heard of the man from Mecca, the trustworthy, so they invited him. Within months of arriving, Muhammad had produced the Constitution of Medina, a formal written agreement between the Muslim emigrants from Mecca, the Arab tribes of Medina, and several Jewish tribes, binding them into a single community with mutual obligations of defense, justice, and coexistence. It was the first written constitution in Islamic history, one of the earliest documented examples of a written multi-faith social contract anywhere. A document that established the rights and responsibilities across religious lines, Muslim, Jewish, Christian and pagan, at a time when such pluralism was not the norm. The city was renamed. Yathrib became Madinat el-Nabi, the city of the Prophet, Medina. But the Quraysh had not finished with Muhammad. In 624 CE, they sent an army south. The Muslims met him, 313 men against roughly 1,000. By every measure, the Muslims should have been destroyed. They won. It was the moment everything changed. A persecuted community of refugees, many of whom had arrived in Medina with nothing, had defeated the most powerful tribe in Arabia. The victory was taken as confirmation that what had begun in a cave in 610 CE was exactly what it claimed to be. The Quraysh came back the following year with 3,000 men, the Battle of Uhud. The Muslims were winning until their archers abandoned their positions to raid the Meccan camp. The Quraysh cavalry swept through the gap. Muhammad was injured. The Muslims retreated to the slopes of the mountain. They survived, but the defeat was real and it was felt. And then in 627 CE, the Quraysh came with 10,000. The largest force ever assembled against the Muslim community. A coalition of tribes from across Arabia united in a single objective: to destroy what Muhammad had built before it grew too large to stop. Muhammad's response was a trench, dug around the exposed approaches to Medina, deep enough and wide enough that the cavalry could not cross it. The strategy was borrowed from Persian military practice, utterly alien to Arabian warfare, where battles were fought in open ground between opposing lines. The Quraysh arrived. They found a hole in the ground between them and the city. They camped outside it for weeks. They couldn't get in, and eventually their coalition fractured and they went home. The Battle of the Trench was the last time the Quraysh would come to Medina as an offensive force. The 10 years in Medina did something that the cave and the revelation alone could never have done. They turned a spiritual movement into a complete civilization. The revelations that came to Muhammad during these years were different in character to what had come before. In Mecca, the Quran had spoken of God, of judgment, of the afterlife, of the obligations of the believer. In Medina, it began to speak of everything else: how to divide inheritance, how to conduct a marriage, how to treat prisoners of war, what justice required in a dispute between neighbours, criminal law, commercial law, family law, constitutional principles, a complete framework for human existence. This is what monotheism actually does. Given time and authority, it replaces everything the gods held together. The 360 gods of Arabia had been a system, religious, economic, political, tribal. Muhammad was offering a different world. By the time he was ready to return to Mecca, he'd built one. 8 years earlier he had left in the night, a price on his head, a city that had tried to destroy everything he had built. He came back with 10,000. The army that marched on Mecca in 630 CE was drawn from tribes across Arabia. Communities that had watched from a distance had chosen sides. The man nobody wanted at the beginning had built something the Quraysh could no longer stop. Abu Sufyan, the leader of the Quraysh, came out to negotiate and converted to Islam on the road. The city that had driven Muhammad out opened its gates. The conquest was nearly bloodless. Muhammad's declaration as he entered was simple. He who lays down his arms will be safe. He who locks his door will be safe. He went to the Kaaba. He circled it 7 times, as pilgrims always had done. He asked for the key. The door was opened. He entered. Inside, the idols, the gods of Arabia, everything the Quraysh had built their world around. Everything that had required his exile, his losses, his years building something strong enough to return. He began to strike them, one by one. 360 idols. As each one fell, he recited the same verse from the Quran. Truth has come, and falsehood has vanished. Indeed, falsehood is bound to vanish. Accounts record that among the images inside the Kaaba was a painting of Mary and Jesus, and that Muhammad covered it with his hands and ordered everything else destroyed. The sources vary on the precise details, but the gesture itself is documented. Something was preserved in the moment of destruction, something he chose to protect. He stood at the doorway of the Kaaba when it was done. Below him, the people of Mecca, the tribe that had tried to destroy him, the community that had buried his wife into poverty and driven him into the desert. He quoted the story of Joseph, the son sold into slavery by his brothers, the man who had every reason for revenge and chose otherwise. I speak to you as Joseph spoke to his brothers. This day there is no reproof against you. Go your way, for you are free. The city was his. He forgave it. Muhammad died in 632 CE, 2 years after the conquest of Mecca. He was 62 years old. Within a century of his death, the faith he built from a revelation had spread from Arabia across North Africa, through Persia into Central Asia, across the Iberian Peninsula into Spain. A civilization that would preserve Greek philosophy while Europe forgot it, advance mathematics, medicine, astronomy and architecture, and reshape the political map of the world in ways that are still visible today. One man, one cave, one night in Ramadan in 610 CE. The speed of it is almost impossible to process. Within the lifetime of people who had known Muhammad personally, who had sat with him and eaten with him and heard his voice, Islam had reached the borders of China and the shores of the Atlantic. Military success was part of the story, but it wasn't the whole story. The civilization that emerged from Medina offered law, order, identity, and belonging on a scale Arabia had never seen before. The people who joined it weren't only joining a theology, they were joining something that worked. 2 billion people today, every one of them tracing their faith back to a single man in a single cave on a single night. Consider how close it came to nothing. The foster mothers who passed him by because he had no father. The grandfather who died before he could protect him. The uncle who stepped forward when nobody else would. The wife who held him while he trembled and told him he was good enough. The Christian scholar who confirmed what he had experienced and then died before any of it began. Remove any one of them, the orphan dies in poverty. The revelation goes unconfirmed. The trembling man on the mountainside concludes he has gone mad and tells no one. Hanging at the very beginning on whether one woman was willing to take in a child and nobody else wanted. History moves through specific people making specific choices in specific moments. Halima took the child, Khadija held her husband, Abu Talib stepped forward, and the orphan from Mecca changed the world.